In the early 1800s, John Bell moved his family from North Carolina to the Red River bottomland in Robertson County, which later became the present-day Adams, Tennessee. Bell purchased some land and a large house for his family. Over the next several years, he acquired more land, increasing his holdings to over 328 acres, and cleared a number of fields for planting. He also became an elder of the Red River Baptist Church. John and his wife, Lucy Bell, had 3 more children after moving to Tennessee. The Bells had a very happy and successful early life at the Red River settlement. But one day, in 1817, John Bell was inspecting his cornfield when he encountered a strange-looking animal sitting in the middle of a corn row. Shocked by the appearance of this animal, which had the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit, Bell shot at it several times. The animal vanished. This was the first documented manifestation of the entity. Bell thought nothing more of the incident, at least not until later, after dinner. That evening, the family began hearing beating sounds on the outside walls of their log home. The mysterious sounds continued with increased frequency and force each night. Bell and his sons often hurried outside to catch the culprit, but always returned empty-handed. During the weeks that followed, the Bell children began waking up frightened, complaining that rats were gnawing at their bedposts. Not long after that, the children began complaining of having their bed covers pulled from them and their pillows tossed onto the floor by a seemingly invisible entity. As time went on, the Bells began hearing faint, whispering voices, which were too weak to understand, but sounded like a feeble old woman singing hymns. The encounters escalated, and the Bells' youngest daughter, Betsy Bell, began experiencing brutal encounters with this invisible entity. He would pull her hair and slap her relentlessly, often leaving welts and handprints on her face and body. The disturbances, which John Bell had his family vow to keep secret, finally escalated to the point that he shared his family trouble with his closest friend and neighbor, James Johnston. Skeptical at first, Johnston and his wife spent the night at the Bell home. Things began peacefully, but once they retired for the evening, they were subjected to the same terrifying disturbances that the Bells had been experiencing. After their bed covers were yanked off and James was slapped, he sprang out of bed, exclaiming, "In the name of the Lord, who are you and what do you want?" The entity did not respond. The rest of the night was peaceful. The next morning, Mr. Johnson explained to the Bells that the culprit was likely an evil spirit, the kind that, quote, the Bible talks about. The entity's voice strengthened over time and became loud and unmistakable. It sang hymns, quoted scripture, carried on intelligent conversation, and once even quoted, word for word, 2 sermons that were preached at the same time on the same day, 13 miles apart. Word of the supernatural phenomena soon spread outside this settlement, even to Nashville, where then Major General Andrew Jackson became interested in the so-called Bell Witch. John Bell Jr., along with his brothers Drury Bell and Jesse Bell, had fought under General Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. A few years later, in 1819, Jackson heard about the disturbances at the Bell home and decided to pay a visit and investigate. As Jackson's entourage, consisting of several men, well-groomed horses, and a large wagon, approached the Bell property, the wagon jolted to a sudden stop. It had become stuck in a muddy creek bed, and the horses were unable to pull it out. At least, that was what the men thought. After several minutes of cursing and trying to coax the horses into pulling the wagon, Jackson proclaimed, "By the Eternal, boys, that must be the Bell Witch." Then, suddenly, a disembodied female voice told Jackson that they could proceed and that she would see them again later that evening. They were then able to proceed across the property, up the lane and to the Bell home. That evening, Jackson told old war stories while his entourage set up their tents in John and Lucy Bell's yard. One of the men claimed to be a witch tamer. After several uneventful hours, he pulled out a shiny pistol and proclaimed that its silver bullet would kill any evil spirit that it came into contact with. He went on to say that the reason nothing had happened to them was because whatever had been haunting the Bells was scared of his silver bullet. Immediately, the man screamed and began jerking his body in different directions, complaining that he was being stuck with pins and beaten severely. A strong, swift kick to the man's posterior region from an invisible foot sent him out the front door. Angry, the entity spoke up and announced that there was yet another fraud in Jackson's party, and that she would identify him the following evening. Now terrified, Jackson's men begged to leave the Bell farm. Jackson insisted on staying. He wanted to know who the other fraud was. The men eventually went outside to sleep in their tents while continuously begging Jackson to leave. What happens next is not clear, but Jackson and his entourage were spotted in nearby Springfield early the next morning, headed back to Nashville. Some allege that Jackson later proclaimed, "I would rather fight the British at New Orleans than to fight the Bell Witch." Over time, Betsy Bell became interested in Joshua Gardner, a young man who lived nearby. With the blessings of both their parents, they decided to marry. Everyone was happy about their engagement. Well, that is, almost everyone. The evil, mysterious entity became furious and repeatedly ordered Betsy not to marry Joshua. Betsy and Joshua's former school teacher, Professor Richard Powell, had been noticeably interested in Betsy for some time and had expressed interest in marrying her. By some accounts, Powell, who was 11 years Betsy's senior, was a student of the occult, ventriloquism, a mathematical genius, and well-versed in horticulture and geology. He was secretly married to a woman in nearby Nashville, Esther Scott, during the time he lived and taught school at Red River, and perceived as a happy-go-lucky bachelor, and expressed his unwavering fondness for Betsy Bell. According to early accounts, Powell politely expressed his disappointment with Betsy's engagement to Joshua and wished her a long and prosperous marriage. Betsy and Joshua could not go to the river, the fields, or even the cave they frequented without the entity nagging them. The constant pressure was more than Betsy Bell could handle, and on Easter Monday of 1821, she met Joshua at the river and broke off the engagement. The disturbances decreased after Betsy and Joshua's engagement ended, but the entity continued to express disdain for John Bell, relentlessly vowing to kill him. Bell had been experiencing episodes of twitching in his face and difficulty swallowing for almost a year. It grew worse over time. By the fall of 1820, his declining health had confined him to the house, where the malicious entity continuously removed his shoes when he tried to walk. He even slapped his face when he recovered from his numerous seizures. Her shrill voice was heard all over the farm, cursing and chastising Old Jack Bell, the nickname she had given him. John Bell breathed his last breath on the morning of December 20th, 1820, after slipping into a coma a day earlier. Immediately after his death, his family found a vial of strange black liquid in the cupboard. John Jr. sprinkled 2 drops on their pet cat's tongue. The cat jumped up into the air, rolled over in midair, and was dead by the time it hit the floor. The entity then exclaimed, "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, which fixed him." John Jr. tossed the mysterious vial into the fireplace. It burst into a bright blue flame and shot up the chimney. John Bell's funeral was one of the largest ever held in all of Robertson County, Tennessee. People attended from miles away, and 3 preachers, 2 Methodists and 1 Baptist, eulogized him. As the crowd of mourners began leaving the graveyard, the Bell Witch entity laughed and sang a song about a bottle of brandy. Her fervent singing didn't stop until the last mourner had left the graveyard. The entity's presence was almost non-existent after John Bell's demise, as though it had fulfilled its promise. In April of 1821, shortly after Betsy Bell had broken off her engagement, the entity visited John Bell's widow, Lucy Bell, and told her that it was leaving but would return in 7 years. The entity did return in 1828, just as promised. Most of the return visit centered on John Bell Jr., with whom the entity discussed the origin of life, civilizations, Christianity, and the need for a major spiritual reawakening. Of particular significance were its predictions of the Civil War and other major events, some of which she had missed. The entity bade farewell after 3 weeks, promising to visit John Bell's most direct descendant in 107 years. The year would be 1935, and the closest living direct descendant at that time was Nashville physician Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, a neurologist and John Bell Sr.'s great-grandson. In 1934, Dr. Bell published a book about the Bell Witch, likely to raise awareness of the spirit's impending return. The book contains the first ever account of the alleged conferences between the entity and John Bell Jr. in 1828. The author's father, Dr. Joel Thomas Bell, had allegedly taken notes during the conferences and, upon his death, passed them down to him. Dr. Bell published no follow-up to his 1934 book. He died in 1945 and is buried in Bellwood Cemetery in Adams, Tennessee. Did the Bell Witch return in 1935 as promised? Some say she didn't, and that if she did, they were not aware of it. But many say she never left the place to begin with. The entity that tormented the Bell family in the Red River settlement almost 200 years ago is often blamed for unexplainable manifestations that occurred near the old Bell farm even today. The faint sounds of people talking and children playing can sometimes be heard in the area, and it's not uncommon to see candle lights dance through the dark fields late at night. Photography is especially difficult. Some pictures taken in the area show mist, orbs of light, and other phenomena, including human-like figures who were not present when the pictures were taken. The cause of the Bell family's torment 200 years ago, along with today's continued phenomena in the area, although to a lesser extent, remain a mystery.
Welcome back, Ghosts and Ghouls, to your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad, a podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as spooky as we were back in the 80s. I'm your ghostly host, Tyler Bentz, and this is your other spooky host,
Woody Brown.
It's finally here, bro.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a sad thing, though. You know, I mean, Halloween, literally, I think when the listeners listen to this episode, if I'm good at math here, I'm pretty sure it's going to come out on Halloween.
I think so.
So this is the finale to the October Spooktacular 2022. And I got to say, man, I guess I could say that I'm always excited about our episodes when we're doing them because this is the Bell Witch. Listener, I need you to understand something real quick. Get in close. Let's talk about this. We've wanted, or at least kind of talked about doing or talking about this story on our show since like day one. It's like one of the first ones we scribbled down. Tyler's been wanting me to get into it. And with a lot of these things, I tend to kind of like hold off until it's time to dive in. You know what I mean? Because I like to learn about it at the same time, you know, as listeners. But we'd kind of planned on doing this one like weeks and weeks ago, and so I kind of read up on it and learned it, and I could not wait until we finally did it. And so now it's finally here. It's the finale of the Spooktacular, and although Tyler looks more like a zombie than a poltergeist right now.
Yeah, I do.
And he probably doesn't sound that excited either, but he is, folks.
Yeah, let me just sort of preface the show with an apology for the way that I sound. My entire family got the flu, and this is day 4 of having a fever, which is weird. My youngest daughter ended up going to urgent care, but all that to say, I'm flying high on Dayquil and Mucinex and all that good stuff, so we should be totally fine. And we're going to edit out all of the iron lung moments. Or the black lung moments?
Black lung, iron lung. Iron lung's the thing you lay in, I think. Yeah, well, we had it like a couple weeks before you, just like literally right before we went to Disney, which was interesting. But I'm glad we're over it. I'm sorry that you've got it. But, man, let's talk about the Bell Witch, bro.
Yeah, let's do it. But before we get into it, let's just cover how this, you know, the quote unquote, and I may be jumping the gun a little bit, but just the way the spirit introduces itself. It says the origin of the Bell Witch is, of course, sort of a mystery, but, you know, depending on where you look or whatever, early accounts say that the spirit stated, "I am a spirit. I once was very happy, but I have been disturbed and made unhappy. I am the spirit of a person who was buried in the woods nearby, and the grave was disturbed. My bones disinterred and scattered, and one of my teeth was lost under this house. I am here looking for that tooth."
Weird.
Jesus, that's terrifying.
That's terrifying. And also, here's another thing about this story. I kind of like read and heard sort of a couple different things about just in general. That's the first time I've heard that at all, which is interesting. It seems like that would be forefront and foremost, like on the top of everybody's.
So this gets even, and this sort of leans into, I'm not going to say, but this leans into sort of my thoughts on like what this thing ultimately is. But
oh man, yeah, no,
I'm not. But
I have my own.
Just this other brief thing that it says. It says in another event, the witch claimed to be, quote, "a spirit from everywhere, heaven, hell, the earth. I am in the air. The houses, any place, any time, have been created millions of years."
Wow. I also read that it like referred to itself as Old Kate Bats.
Yeah.
Did you read that?
Yeah. See, that's what's weird about it is because it, again, I'm holding back because I don't want to like give anything away, but I feel like there's some trickster elements here. I feel like a lot of like the narrative kind of like changes throughout.
Well, it's strange because like we kind of said at at the presentation of the story in general, it all kind of started, or at least is noted to have begun with this weird sort of almost shape-shifting.
Oh, it's my favorite part.
Animal that showed up, you know.
Yeah.
and it was half dog, half rabbit, you know. And, you know, okay, so it's early 1800s, down south, Tennessee. Could this guy have gotten some kind of bad moonshine? I'm not sure.
I mean, maybe. But, I mean, from what we know, the guy is
Extremely wealthy.
Successful.
I mean, 328 acres in the middle, 1800s.
Yeah,
Dude,
but I
like,
mean, out in the middle of nowhere, like Tennessee, I feel like
that's a lot of farmland, dude.
No, it definitely is. But I'm saying, like, back then, it was a lot easier to come by than what it would be like now. But I mean, yes, he was like extremely wealthy. And how many kids did he have in all? Because he had like the family was pretty big.
Yeah, I think it was like 6 or 7.
Yeah, right.
Something along those lines. You know, and of course, I love it. Just like a lot of these stories. First off, again, like going back to like the things that we like and the things that are like, to me, some of the scariest pieces of horror really kind of come from this like historical period, you know, because like, and I think a lot of scary movies kind of borrow this sometimes, you know, and like they'll just set it in this early 1800s, early 1900s setting because for some reason with the lack of technology and the inability to be able to like warn people in another town or whatever, if you're like a psycho or like just some kind of evil spirit, it's kind of like this is your prime sort of time period to be around, you know? I mean, around the same time period, you're thinking like Jack the Ripper, you've got all these like, I say around the same time period, within that like sort of 50 to 100 years sort of range, you've got the ability to sort of be elusive and not get caught. So, you know what I mean? And so it just, for some reason, that setting is always like scarier in a way.
I think a lot of the reason is, I mean, yes, it's like a period piece. So like, you know, that
it's harder to fake, in other words, dude.
Right. But we also got to look at like, and I'm not saying that this has anything to do with this, but it's like you also kind of have to look at like, you know, there was like the sort of the spiritualist movement, you know, that would be around that time. So like, you know, maybe some of, you know, for the skeptics that want to say like, oh, well, that was just sort of like in the zeitgeist at the time. But I don't know. I don't know how much bearing that has. But what I was going to say is I think there's something about that era or that little place in time that just carries like and you know, before up until that point, it carries like this weird sort of like isolation. So
yeah,
especially here in America, you know, the New World, you know, so there's a lot of like land and territory, but not a ton of people compared to like these other countries that have been, you know, populated long ago. And so you have these people that are like, you know, like this guy, like Bell, he has, how many did you say? 360 something acres of land just out in the middle of nowhere. And so you think like, yeah, he's probably going to go to town like here and there for, you know, dry goods and whatever. But for the most part, they're kind of isolated to this their house, their little like camp. And, you know, once the sun goes down, I mean, other than like candlelight and lanterns and stuff, it's, I don't know, something about that to me lends itself to being like a lot creepier.
Yeah.
Know?
I mean, gosh, you know, even like if you, I don't know how long it's been, listener, since you've been on anything more than, let's say, like 50 acres, right? But, you know, that's even still a lot these days. And if you're just out there, you know, a couple years ago, myself and my buddy Clayton and his cousin went camping at a farm pretty close to the Georgia-Alabama state line. And I don't even know how many acres it's on, man. But we kind of drove around the property in my Jeep and that kind of thing. And it's still expansive enough to where as we were camping out there, I mean, you do, like you said, you feel isolated. And so imagining a house built, now I'm not sure where their house is in relation to 328 acres, but even still, yeah, their town wasn't like humongous. It was small. Just to kind of give you some geographical perspective here, if you're not from our area or you don't know where the Red River is and all that kind of thing. So it's about, nowadays, what's known as Adams, Tennessee, is about 42 miles northwest of Nashville, Tennessee. And it's about, 5 to 7 miles from the Tennessee and Kentucky border. And the Red River, this is interesting now. Again, I know last week I kind of got historical on you guys, and I'm going to get a little geographical here and historical here. But the Red River is actually the second largest river basin in the South. And for you science nerds out there, it's named for its reddish water color from passing through the what they call the red bed country watershed. And red beds are sedimentary rocks, typically that consist of sandstone, siltstone, shale, that are predominantly red in color due to the presence of ferric oxides. Anyway, pretty cool. But it does span all the way from like Texas, down through southern Oklahoma, Arkansas, and into Tennessee and Kentucky. So it's it's a pretty cool area, and just ripe for something spooky like this.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I initially, as I was reading about this and how it starts with like a half, which by the way, hopefully by now, if you're listening, or if this is the first time you've ever listened to our show, I want to make something clear, like whether or not Tyler or myself kind of believes that this entity or this account or this phenomenon is true isn't really the purpose of our podcast. Really, in terms of this kind of stuff, and really anything that we talk about, besides the true fact that Tim Burton's Batman is amazing, and that 1989 was one of the greatest years for movies.
Bat summer.
Yeah, like we'll put out facts like that, but this stuff is more like, this is us just like delivering the story to you because we think it's interesting and it's spooky and fun to talk about. Okay, all that to say, I don't think the spiritualist movement was talking a lot about half man, half rabbit.
No.
Am I right?
And the spiritualist movement is like, at least when I think of it, I think of, more of your...
Seances.
Yes, seances, sort of your high society folks would be into like, contacting the dead, and like mediums and stuff. Like they became like, super, like some became like really famous, like the Fox sisters. And a lot of them were charlatans and frauds, and so it kind of faded away. But I would imagine that like some of that would have at least be in the minds of some of the people, whether it be the family or some of the people like around them, adjacent to the Bell family.
I would say it certainly gave them sort of a way to sort of define some of the stuff that was going on, and relate to it for sure. It's kind of like if no one had ever heard of aliens, we'd be like, my God, it's a Thunderbird. You know what I mean? So like the fact that it starts with like this shape-shifting thing. So when I was, again, first reading over this, I didn't know much about it. I thought, Tyler says it's really cool. I just wonder if, is it going to be, what is it?
Which, by the way, this is my favorite part of the whole story.
What, the half dog, half rabbit?
Just the high strangeness, weird part of it.
Yeah. Well, when I first read that, I was like, wait a second, dude. I thought this was about a witch, and I thought this was about, everybody's going to get ready to make fun of me. I thought it was about there's something that had to do with a bell. Not even joking. I was thinking Liberty, I was thinking some sort of like artifact that, this energy was coming from, and that it was a bell. I didn't realize until I started learning about this story that it was actually their last names. Anyway, the fact that this started happening, I'm thinking like, oh man, what do we have here? Is this something, and again, because just like we just talked about with the spiritualist movement, several months ago I read Skinwalker Ranch, and so I'm like, oh, is this some sort of like cool like area that there's a lot of acreage. Maybe this is one of those spots. Gosh, it's close to Kentucky and West Virginia, and all that area up there, man, is just ripe for that weird, rad strangeness.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but yeah, you could be right.
And
after these messages, we'll be right back.
This is Amy Poehler. My new movie, Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2, is coming to theaters June 14th, and it's making me feel joy and sadness and anger, definitely some disgust, and I think a little fear. But I'm also feeling these new emotions like anxiety, embarrassment, envy, and ennui.
It's what you call the boredom.
Okay, that one was weird. It's going to be the feel everything movie of the summer. Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2, rated PG, parental guidance suggested. Only in theaters June 14th. Get tickets now.
America's future can be determined by our dreams and our visions.
It was very intense, bright
over 200 years, there have been reports of giant man-like creatures.
From another dimension, another world, I don't know.
The most intriguing mystery on the North American continent.
Hey, this is Bryce Johnson from the Bigfoot Collectors Club, and you're listening to Tyler and Woody on That Would Be Rad, because that is rad.
I don't know, man. It's just interesting to me that that's sort of like what sort of kicks off in this guy's mind, this event. So it never really talks about that animal or creature being seen again, from what I could find.
No, but a couple things about it that are interesting. So I guess he's out like checking his corn, I think. Yeah. I may be misspeaking there, but
no, it was corn. It was corn.
Okay, yeah. He's checking his corn, and I think this thing kind of like is up ahead, jumps out in front of the path or whatever, and completely startles him. It's weird because some accounts say that it was like very big, but I don't know if like historically that's something that was maybe embellished along the way, or if that's like from his account. I don't know. But regardless, this thing kind of like jumps out. You know, he pulls out his gun, shoots, and the thing completely vanishes into thin air.
Yeah, that's an aspect that I hope you received, listener, whenever you're listening to that. When I said that it vanished, poof, right?
Yep.
It's just like it is, which again reminded me of the kind of stuff that happened at Skinwalker Ranch.
Right.
Now, we'll get, I promise you, I want to get into theories because it's just completely fascinating. I've got one that I don't think maybe lines up with what you think. It's just something that like I thought of that does deal with kind of like the trickster motif.
Time traveler.
That you're kind of mentioning. No, not this time. Well, gosh, I say that out loud. And I mean, I could be convinced pretty easily that it was a time traveler.
Also, before you move on, I also found in some of, when I was looking into it, and it never totally, I'm kind of bummed out because from what I found, it never really goes into like what they were actually seeing, but it also says that the kids were seeing like, you know, strange or unusual types of animals like around the farm at the time. So I don't know what that means. It's like, are they sort of getting like hyped up because of what their dad saw, and like suddenly now they're seeing weird animals?
Yeah.
Or like, I just wish I wish they would have like sort of, you know,
elaborated a little bit.
Yeah, because like that's really interesting to me. It's like maybe there is an element of the, you know, take the whole haunting Bell Witch thing out of it, but it's like maybe this you know, half rabbit, half dog, this, you know, therianthrope, if you listen to a couple episodes back, this shapeshifter thing, maybe that was a totally separate thing. And all these weird, unusual animals that the kids were seeing around, like, I mean, heck, for all we know, maybe that was a completely different phenomena that was happening, you know?
And I totally forgot about that. I did put in my notes that they did report strange animals with strange features. In parentheses, I wrote down in my notes here, like cryptids, question mark,
yeah,
you know?
I know.
Then they also started seeing like, quote, dead man's candles at the edge of the tree line.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've kind of talked about orbs, and we've talked about will-o'-the-wisps a little bit before and that kind of thing. And that's what that made me think of. I did read somewhere that they would like see these candles at the edge of the tree line, and they never went further than that. In other words, like they just stayed at the edge of the tree line, which, by the way, is freaking terrifying.
Yeah.
Because let's just take all the supernatural out of it for just a second and just imagine that it's like a group of just crazy hillbillies in the hills of Tennessee sitting or standing at the tree line with candles just, you know, like, good Lord, man, the hills have eyes.
Yeah. Well, and that was a much more common, you know, because technically this would be like in Appalachia, you know, so the idea of like what they would call like spook lights or witch lights, or like Woody said, will-o'-the-wisps, that was a pretty common occurrence back then. Like I remember my grandmother talking about them, and you know, it's weird. I thought of this the other day, and I'm not driving away from the dock just yet, but I thought of this the other day, and I remember when my grandmother's like really like straight-laced. She's in her 80s. She's starting to get up there, and like, you know, I think a little bit of dementia is like starting to settle in, which is really sad. But I was thinking the other day about a comment that she made years and years and years ago. And I think maybe it was because I had asked her when I used to live there, when I saw like the lights in the loft or whatever, I think I asked her, hey, did you guys ever see any lights in the woods? Or, like with someone like her who's very, very anchored in like reality, I would have approached it as like not using any sort of paranormal terminology. I remember asking her, and I cannot remember like the reference, but it was something about like her dad, who, I mean, he would have lived like up in the mountains, like, up in North Georgia. And there was some term that she used where like something about like, yeah, he used to see like fire, what they would call, what the old timers, which, I mean, her saying old timers, that meant like her grandfather and dad, they used to talk about seeing like what they would call fire on the mountain. Man. And it just pops into my head the other day, and I was like, man, I've like before it gets bad or whatever, like I need to reach out.
You got to go talk to
him. Yeah. But anyway, all that to say is like, all that to say is that like spook lights, witch lights, will-o-the-wisps, that was a fairly common thing back then.
Yeah. Another thing about this entity, so you mentioned that it, told them that there's like bones from all over, that it comes from all worlds, which again, man, now that you're the one that mentioned time travel this time. But I agree. Okay. But like they also started hearing like this, just like last week's episode, I feel like has a bunch of those moments where we're going to say like each one of these individual elements make it completely terrifying and interesting in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So again, they would see these strange creatures, strange animals with strange features. They started seeing these dead man's candles around the tree line. They started hearing doors knocking, chains dragging, rats gnawing on bedposts, disembodied voices of this woman who referred to herself as Kate, apparently. And this voice then described its intention to kill this John Bell, but then also targeted this Betsy. And the witch, which that's what I'm just going to refer to her as from now, the witch would like torment her. And also I've read that it would also act like a possessive mother toward her.
It is weird that whatever this thing was sort of soloed out the parents as like, well, I don't want to give it away, but like,
yeah, but like, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say it's interesting though, because she seemed to like, but like the spirit or whatever this thing is, seemed to kind of take a liking a little bit to Lucy and John Jr.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
I got some ideas on that, bro. All right, let's talk about, like you were just kind of saying, it's interesting that she had this like negative interest, so to speak, in John Bell and Betsy, and then sort of had, I don't know about a fondness, but like at least didn't treat Lucy Bell and John Bell Jr. negatively for whatever reason. We kind of talked about it at the top. So Betsy, planned to marry a guy named Joshua Gardner, who was like a neighbor. And for whatever reason, the witch would like torment Betsy and Joshua no matter where they went, man. They would like frequent like these, they would have little spots. Look, we don't know what they were doing. We're not making any assumptions here. But they were youngsters. They were in love. They were going to get married. They're kind of just walking around talking about life maybe. Maybe sometimes they get tired. Lay down a plank, thing by the river and just want to like, talk about the clouds or whatever.
Pull their car into a special parking spot.
They don't have a car yet. It's in 1800, but you know what I'm saying.
Wagon.
They're there for whatever reason. They're constantly being tormented. Their neck, which is just the worst term ever. Can we talk about that for a minute? What is that?
Yeah, I've never totally understood that terminology, but
that being said, I can't wait until my kids are teenagers so that when they have their like friends over that they have a crush on or whatever, I'll just be like, okay, kids, I'm going to walk out of the room, but we'll have no necking in here.
Oh, perfect.
Really kind of expecting a little bit more of a laugh on that one.
Okay. I'm trying to hold back a lot of the laughing because I know it'll erupt into a lot of coughing.
Okay. So anyhow, they're constantly tormented. Imagine just being this guy, right? You're starting to date this girl. Things are going well. She's pretty. She comes from a wealthy family. you can kind of just see your future. You're like, man, I can start working on this land, and someday, you know, can raise up my kids on this land, and just the family will grow, and it's going to be good. And then every single time you're around this girl, you guys start hearing voices, chains dragging, you know, that would just be just terrifying. And some of the ways that these people were tormented, man,
oh yeah,
really kind of take it to the next level. This business about being slapped in the face in the middle of the night.
Oh yeah.
Not to mention when poor John Bell, it sounds like, you know, you read these things when he's having a difficult time swallowing. Half of his face is numb. You know, it's hard for me not to imagine the guy suffered a stroke here. They just didn't know the cause of that, right? So he's got a stroke. He's got difficulty walking. And apparently the witch just like pulls his shoes off while he's trying to walk around. I mean, dude.
Yeah.
This guy's getting tortured, man.
Well, and it also says like, and it uses the word relentlessly, that they were struck, pinched, and having their hair pulled. Which,
good Lord.
I mean, just imagine. I mean, and you know, as we all know about these things, like at night is when it all like ramps up. So imagine like every night you're just laying in bed, and suddenly your hair is yanked or you're slapped in the face. It's like, God, like what a horrible life.
Yeah. One thing that is super interesting to me as well that we didn't really mention yet is, you know, look, I'm thinking it's hard to imagine that it's mid-1800s. It's in the South. There's a lot of acreage. These folks were slave owners. And one thing that I read were some of the enslaved workers of the property started complaining about stuff too, man. And started to have interactions with these like disembodied voices sometimes. And I loved when I read this because I thought, our buddy Tim Marchenko is going to love this. So they started hearing these disembodied voices that would mimic family members' voices.
There it is.
And give warnings about John Bell, even saying stuff like, Mr. Bell is a bad man, and that kind of stuff. And the more attention it was given, the more curious came to interact with it and stuff. And then the louder it would become.
Which is pretty common. You know, it's like there's an element of whatever this thing is that like they feed on attention and like intent and like thought, you know. We always talk about like tulpas and all that stuff. I think there's some sort of, I don't know what it is. I don't know how to like sort of pinpoint the two, but I feel like there's like clear correlation between the two.
Yeah, there's got to be some sort of relationship with you giving mental energy and attention to whatever it is, and then it manifesting stronger and more often or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? And I mean, you know, you could also argue, especially on the skeptic side of all this, just kind of like, you know, the second that I wanted to get a Jeep, well, now I start seeing Jeeps everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's pareidolia.
Yeah, so, you know, maybe it just kind of like you talked about the youngsters maybe spotting or identifying strange creatures. Well, maybe they were just seeing normal creatures.
Right.
But because they're spooked and on edge, they felt like they were abby-normal. Just kidding.
Well,
that's a little Young Frankenstein joke for you guys that like Mel Brooks. Go ahead.
Well, it also says Betsy, Drury, and John began to hear unaccounted for knocking on the doors and windows. They would hear the sound of like wings flapping against the ceiling and the sound of the rats gnawing on the bedpost, which we'll get back to that.
You live out on a farm.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. But more disturbingly was they would hear the sound of choking or strangling. And then, like Woody said, chains dragging and heavy objects hitting the floor. Sounds emanating, this is crazy, sounds emanating from the bedroom as if beds were suddenly and roughly pulled apart, to which was added the sounds of fighting dogs chained together, making the noise deafening.
I mean, you know, sometimes...
I mean, my thing with, like, the rats and, like, even the flapping of wings on the ceiling, like... I mean, I'm by far not a skeptic, but I could see how that could be.
Those could be, yeah.
You know, you could explain that away. But I mean, a lot, you know, the knocking, like sort of mysterious, like knocking on the doors and windows and stuff. Like,
yeah.
And again, it kind of goes back to Tim Marchenko. It's like maybe it wasn't necessarily, you know, calling you, but it is kind of baiting you to go over to the window or answer the door.
And that's the part that really is the scariest to me.
Right.
Because even, and folks, we say it almost not every episode, but so very many, you got to go check out Tim Marchenko's book. You can get it on Amazon. I promise you, he's not a sponsor of the show. He is a friend and a listener. But I wouldn't be saying this if I didn't believe it. You need to read this book. It is fascinating. It's so well written.
Yeah.
And it really kind of one of the primary things that it made me think of is just like being in a situation where you hear, you think you hear anyway, the voice of a family member calling to you, whether it's to come check something out or for help. There's not very many of us here that would just like ignore it, right? And so the fact that there could be an entity, a creature, something that can do that is freaking terrifying, man.
Yeah.
Ay, ay, ay.
Yeah. And, I mean, I think it's equally terrifying whether you're looking at it as like, okay, well, is this, which I think Tim illustrates beautifully in the book, is that like, okay, well, maybe this is a tactic of some sort of, you know, we're talking in terms of like very sort of spiritual, ethereal things as far as like the Bell Witch is concerned. But it, you know, even just the idea of like, oh, maybe it's some sort of like primate or animal that we haven't discovered yet that's like able to mimic and do these things.
Like a parrot or something.
Yeah, that's just as scary almost, you know?
Yeah.
It's bizarre.
I tell you what, you know what? I'm going to get crazy here. The first person that messages us on Instagram at That Would Be Rad, you message us, and I'll send you a copy of the book.
Whoa.
The first person that does it, as you're listening now, message me or message us, and I'm going to send you a copy.
Holy cow.
Boom. That's it. That's how I roll.
Well, I mean,
it's great. It's Halloween.
It is an amazing book, especially for this season. It is awesome.
Tyler still has my copy.
I was going to say, I hope you're not planning on giving him your copy because I have it.
No. Yeah. No, I do want to talk about a couple things that, you know, this all didn't just go away quickly. You know, so many of these accounts, it's kind of like a somewhat temporary thing, and it goes away. This lasted for several years, and people would kind of come around because they're interested in it. We mentioned Andrew Jackson, which is just
it's
wild
amazing,
to me that
dude.
There's that connection there.
Yeah.
But also there's this local guy named Frank Miles, who was this like, they described him as like 7 foot tall, 300-pound oaf of a man, not scared of anything. And he came to the house and he came to visit and left terrified and just was like, nope, and just got the heck out of Dodge, which is, I love when that kind of stuff happens.
Yeah, me too.
And again, man, it goes back to what I said. This is part of the reason why, not that it's more believable to me, just the fact that it's like scarier for this to have happened during that time period because it's way harder to fake. Now, could someone have, especially with 17 million children, could someone have just like faked that and all that? Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe it was, I don't think it was Mr. Bell.
No.
You know, this is a successful guy who's an elder at the local church. He doesn't want to call this kind of, all this evil stuff happening on his land. He's not just growing corn for the fun of it.
Right.
He's not just growing corn just to feed his family. This guy's trying to sell things, right? He's a businessman. Now he's got like these evil things happening. You think that's going to bode well for the crops that he's trying to sell?
Well, but also I think a really interesting thing about this story that sort of sets it on its own, like sets it apart and sets it as its own entire thing is like, you know, family members and other things, like they would have these like extremely long interactions with, it's not just like we saw some weird stuff and then there was some like, we heard some like knocking on the doors and windows and then that was it. It's like, no, these people are like, this thing was able to repeat, you know, you said up top, it's like, it was able to recite perfectly 2 separate sermons, like church Christian sermons that were like 12, you know, they were given on the same day that were 12 miles apart from each other. So I'm guessing like, I think one was at a church, one was at like a tent revival thing.
13 miles apart.
Oh, 13 miles apart. But it's like
which makes it even spooky.
Yeah, on a Friday. But anyway, it's just that idea that these people are having like intimately long encounters with these things, and that's something that you don't see that a lot, you know.
No, and the physical, like the the slapping of the face and the shoes being pulled off of his feet while he was walking. And, could it have been some sort of over-exaggeration for their, unfortunately, dad that had a stroke and was just like fumbling all over himself, maybe? Sure. But again, the motive, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about in my theories, is what would be the motive here for someone or anyone to just fake this?
Yeah.
But like the hymns and the quoted scripture and the more sort of like biblical knowledge that this thing is just that's weird, man. So let's talk about let's talk about how weird the name Drury is.
Yeah, Drury is a weird name. No. Before you continue, that's something that's always like been like so scary to me, is that idea that like I can't remember like what movie this is from. I'm sure it's like a movie or a book where it basically says that like, oh, well, of course they're able to speak, scripture and Bible verses and stuff. And it's talking about like demons, and it's saying, of course they're going to be intimate with that because they were around when it was like creating.
Yeah, dude. That's even
happening.
Yeah.
That's so
it's kind of like this, man. It's like, imagine it's like somebody, I don't know, describing moments in time that happened in high school, right? You might not have been friends with those other people, but you can kind of describe sort of some of the events that happened and just be like,
you're adjacent to them.
Oh yeah. That, golly, that's some scary stuff, man. Dude.
Well, and also I think there's something scary about it because, and I've heard a lot of accounts of this with like demonic possession and that kind of thing, but because I guess when we think of like this kind of stuff, and I'm not saying like what this is particularly like that or demonic or whatever, but it's like when we think of these like sort of overtly like evil or dark like entities, and these things are causing like pain and harm and stuff, we think like, oh, well, the darkness is fought with the light, and I'm holding a crucifix out, and that's going to like fend them off. And if I say this Bible verse, or if I recite this prayer, it's going to like dispel these things. And it's the idea that like, and I guess that's where like the spooky part is for me, is the idea that no, these things are also reciting those same things. Yeah. And they're just fine.
Yeah, they're not fazed by it,
That's
dude.
super scary.
It's kind of like those vampire movies where like they hold up a cross or something and nothing happens, and they're like, ha.
Right.
Then it's like, oh man, wait a second now. I thought this is the way that I'm supposed to defeat you guys, and it doesn't even work. Yeah, dude, that's terrifying. Okay, I want to talk about how like the whole thing surrounding John Bell's death and stuff, no matter which way you slice it.
Real quick, I know I'm horrible with interrupting, but
we will return after these messages.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no dead.
Hey, this is Woody.
And this is Tyler. And you're listening to That Would Be Rad.
And now, back to our show.
I also found that it was able to recite verses in Latin, which is like, next level.
It is. It kind of does a little number to my theory, but because that would imply some education.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, again, if you take it at its word,
I meant like basically if it was like a hoax, it would imply that whoever the hoaxer was would have been educated. Which I'm not saying that's my theory.
Well, but I mean, if you believe it at its word, a spirit from everywhere, heaven, hell, and earth, and have been created for millions of years. It's like, man, that's so scary to me.
Man,
it's just that ancient thing.
Oh yeah. All right, let's talk about the circumstances that surrounded John Bell's death. So, on the surface, at first, again, reading it for the first time, I thought, okay, the poor old guy, died. But the fact that they find this like vial of liquid, strange black liquid or something is what I think they talk about it, next to him. And then I got to say, God, I got a number of cats. And I think I said this on the show, but certainly Tyler and I have talked about it, I think on the Patreon, but, showing my son Stranger Things and the fact that, like, the first time that he, like, gets sad in that show is when Dustin's cat dies. Mm-hmm. To hear that they're just like, oh, I wonder what this stuff is. Give the cat some. That just sucks, man.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. But, okay, the fact that it, like, jumps in the air, rolls over midair, and then just dies immediately, it's like, okay, well, this is poison. And then he throws this vial into the fireplace. And then, again, man, all these people are hearing these voices. Like, the fact that it's just, the entity exclaims in this room full of people, I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, which fixed him. What? Like...
Yeah, well, I didn't understand that. What did that mean?
That means, like, the witch said that out loud for all to hear, claiming, essentially, that she was the one that poisoned him. I read, too...
Oh, that was when he died.
Yeah, when he died.
I thought... Holy cow.
They also heard laughter, singing, and listen to this, dude. At his funeral, man. And I think, we talked about this up top, but I just want to reiterate this here. At the funeral, people heard laughing and a song being sung about a bottle of brandy that didn't stop until the last person who was there to mourn or in the ceremony or whatever had left the graveyard. They heard the song the whole time.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Like, and
I mean, that's the definition of insult to injury.
Yeah, and you're telling me nobody was like, where's that sound coming from? I'll tell you what they wouldn't have been able to pick out was a dadgum Bluetooth speaker because it was a time traveler. Anyway.
Hey, there you go. Okay. One thing, since we're going into like crazy theories, maybe it's black goo. Do you know about black goo?
I know what black goo is in Dungeons and Dragons, and perhaps there's some similarities, but why don't you tell me about it?
Well, I mean, this will eventually be its own like thing, but like in like ufology, especially in like the 90s and stuff, there was this idea that like people were able to see this like this stuff that was like called black goo, and even down to this conspiracy theorist guy who, I mean, he kind of went off the rails. This guy named Max Spears. He was on this radio or this like television show in Poland, this American guy, and talking about all this stuff. And like as the show went on, it was like he started. You could tell that like he was like becoming more and more like intoxicated or more and more like out of it. Like as the show progressed, which. I don't know. Maybe he took something like right before it started. Yeah, it's real weird.
And you can like, can you and then watch this? This is like a thing that you can watch like happening online.
Yeah, I'll have to find it. God, I mean, this is like
on a newscast. Is that
no? It doesn't show him dying on the air. No, this is like deep, pretty deep conspiracy knowledge here. But after he got done with the show, I think he went back to like his hotel room or I can't remember. Again, like we'll do another show on this, but like. Ended up dying, and then they found him, and he had this like black liquid pouring out of like his ears and his nose and his mouth.
Whoa!
And he had talked about like black goo being this like, I mean, conceptually it's pretty wild, but it's like this idea that it's some sort of like extraterrestrial stuff that is like, I mean, I guess you can look at it almost as like Venom, Spider-Man, Marvel Comics.
Yeah,
where it's like. It is a way for like extraterrestrials to like communicate or like control things, almost like.
Oh yeah, okay. So like I guess the way they get inside of them, they control that person, and then only maybe some sort of like symbiotic relationship, or maybe even parasitic.
Right.
Wow.
Well, yeah, and that the parasitic is the key. Is it's like so from what I gather, what it is, it's like basically imagine you come in contact with this, or you're injected, or somebody. Gives it to you in your food or whatever. Now it's in you. So all of your thoughts, everything that you say is all like transmitted almost like a spooky action at a distance style. So all of your thoughts and everything are able to be heard or seen from another location.
Man.
Boy, I never thought we'd be talking about black goo on
wow, that's
Bell
pretty cool.
Witch episode.
Definitely different than the black
and so
slime that I was talking about from Dungeons & Dragons. It basically just engulfs you and can digest you right there. But go ahead.
Oh, wow. But no, but it also works, I think, as like sort of like nanotechnology where it can just flat out kill you also. So yeah,
man,
that's black goo.
Wow, that's interesting. And so maybe
was very poorly done.
No, but maybe he had a vial of this stuff next to his bed. So
never know.
I don't know, man. Once it starts getting into John Bell Jr. and like the promises of the witch, coming back just like anything that John Bell Jr. said about it, like, well, it promised it would come back 107 years and and then the fact that it visited John Bell Jr. 7 years later and, stayed with him for however many, like 3 weeks. Once it gets to that point, I'm kind of like, I don't know what's happening here. But I think it is time for us to start talking about theories.
Okay, love it.
Are you down?
I can't wait. This is what I've been waiting on. Real quick, but before we move on, we should also say that there was an element of this where Lucy Bell, which would have been one of the, was she one of the?
Is the wife?
Oh, it was the wife. Okay,
yeah.
So Lucy Bell and then John Jr. were left unharmed for the most part. It said that the spirit claimed that Lucy Bell was, and then quote, the most perfect woman living. And the witch showed a great deal of compassion toward her, even caring for her and singing to her when she was ill. And then it says, and then this is what I meant by like these long, intimate, like encounters. It said John Jr. commonly had long, intense conversations with the witch, but he never failed to show his animosity for it, declaring it to be the spirit of the damned. Man. So I think that's a really weird kind of thing. And then also there's another element about this that's sort of bizarre. And I don't, again, it's high strangeness, so I love it, but I don't know where it fits in. So one of like the family slaves named Dean stated that he encountered the witch several times and that it appeared frequently in the form of a large black dog or wolf, sometimes with 2 heads, sometimes with no head. This is where it's sort of like, okay. Dean also claimed to be turned into a mule and attacked several times by the witch. He carried with him at all times an axe and a witch ball that his wife made to protect him from the witch's influence. So a witch ball was almost like a ward or like a
talisman of some sort,
like a talisman of protection type thing you would carry around so that witches couldn't get into your mind.
Like everything just turns into D&D.
Yeah. Oh yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Ring of protection.
Yeah, but I just had to say that because
I completely forgot to talk about demons.
They're bizarre, but I think they're worth noting them.
Oh well, nah. I mean, there was a couple other things too, like in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, there was like coal thrown, and then like a place called like the Hickman House, or something like where not the Hickman House, the Hickman.
Well, wait, real quick. What is the part about this that? Like, I guess I don't understand. So from this is, the research is like so sprawling. Like it talks about like the story continued to Tennessee.
Yeah.
South
that's
Carolina.
What I was talking about. So like, I don't know, man, after all this happened, it kind of like I guess sort of like
the descendants kind of spread out.
The mythos of this witch kind of like spread into nearby communities, and that spread further. And so there has been like stuff like this thing in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, where like these people bought a house. Then in the middle of the night, all this like coal was being thrown around on the outside of their house, and then also like on the inside of the house.
Dude.
And so immediately they blamed it on the Bell Witch.
Dude, this is, I mean, you know what you're talking about.
Is this I wrote it in my notes, and
the Kelly Hopkinsville.
Hold on. This is what it says in my notes. Is this the Hopkinsville goblins?
That's exactly. I mean, what are the odds that this story would be,
somehow intertwined?
Somehow intertwined with the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins, which I think was like 1967 or 68, where basically this really rural family, kind of like regular country mountain folk, were kind of invaded over the course of like an entire night. And I mean, we're talking like the sons and the husband like firing off like shotguns, like running through all their ammo like all night long. And these things are like hopping out of trees and like rolling around on the ground and flying up into the air, and like bullets are like.
It's weird.
What?
So you said this happens like in the 60s. The thing that I'm talking about, 1890, bud.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, dude.
That's
weird.
That's crazy, man.
Listen to this, and you know, I'm sure, because I was a little curious of this, and I can't believe I hadn't mentioned it yet. I'm wondering, what about the descendants now? Where are they? What do they think about it all? Do they even think anything about it? Are they public about this? What I found was that, listen to this, dude. This is nuts to me. 2018, dude. 2018. A descendant named Bob Bell started reporting this like poltergeist activity in his home. He does not live in this old school land or whatever. He just started reporting like weird stuff started happening as he's going through things in his house, because he basically said that like, and I don't have it all right here in front of me, but basically he was saying that like, I figured that maybe something that I had to be tied to that old family house. Well, he finds this freaking old family Bible. Now, listener, if you're not from the South and or like a hardcore, old school, multi-generational sort of like Christian upbringing, you might not know sort of the tradition of like the family Bible. But it's an old, I mean like old tradition that essentially, you know, for some people like goes back hundreds of years, where there is a Bible in the family, and you would like, there's a sometimes in the front section there's like a family tree that you would fill out and pass it down generationally. And so that's what this is talking about. So he finds this old family Bible and is just like, I don't, you know, this is the Bible, but he takes it out of the house and the activity stops completely.
No way. That's great. That is
crazy,
awesome. Correction, the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins was on the night of August 21st, 1955. So I was...
But still, man, that's not 1890, you know? I mean, that's interesting.
Oh, no. Absolutely. I did find it interesting that you said that it sounded like things were being like thrown around on the outside and the inside. That was exactly what was happening with the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins.
And see, I purposely... Well, not really purposely. I just didn't dive into the Hopkinsville thing because I knew you would know it. And I knew just like putting that in my notes, you know, it would trigger this whole thing. All right. I really do want to dive into what is going on here.
Yeah.
So I have some ideas. First, let me take I'm going to take an approach this time around of, for a second, I am just going to pretend like I am wiping the table. Like it's not a poltergeist. It's not anything sort of spiritual or paranormal, okay? If it wasn't, I'm not saying it isn't, I'm just saying if it wasn't, then what? And here are two of my sort of Columbo theories here. The first one is a lot of, we talk about this, I think we talked about it last week a little bit or in one of the episodes previously, but certainly we have before, talking about a lot of the voodoo and hoodoo kind of cultures and stuff being brought over on, you know, and being a large part of the slaves' lives until they were converted to Christianity or whatever. But still, even still, there was like pieces of that culture still present. And so I think potentially some of these slaves potentially were using these like stories and planting strange sort of creature stories and all this to potentially poison their enslaver and get the heck out of Dodge. That's one sort of like surface level, very quick sort of like, oh, the butler did it. You know what I mean?
What is we've already covered this one time, and I think it ended up being like a total urban legend, but like, isn't there like a story where similar kind of thing where like one of like the family, like the nanny, like one of the slaves ended up like poisoning like a pie or something?
I don't know, man.
I can't remember. I feel like we covered it maybe on the Marie Laveau episode. Anyway.
That's weird that you say that because, never mind. I don't even, that's just dumb coincidence.
What are you talking about?
Well, Ann and I are rewatching Game of Thrones or whatever, and I couldn't remember if
Courtney just started it too.
Well, I do. Oh my God, dude, my parents.
Oh,
like now, but listen now. I got to tell you, have I talked about this on the show too, or is this just something that I've talked about with folks in general? Like, it's very difficult for me to recommend a show like Game of Thrones to my folks because, you know, if you've seen Game of Thrones, it's like there's tons of nudity, a lot of violence. It's just like overtly sort of sexual in a lot of, you know, to me. And look, I'm not complaining about, I'm just going to put this out there and forgive me for being crude if you think so. I'm not going to complain too often about seeing a naked lady. Okay. You know, so don't get it twisted, as they say. But like to like recommend something like that to my folks who are very like conservative and you know, respectable people, it was just difficult. But we were eating dinner with them and they're like, oh man, we started this new show called House of Dragons and it's pretty cool, but like, I don't really know I'm like, what? You guys got to watch Game of Thrones. You know, that's and then I forewarned them, hey, there's a lot of nudity in the first season and yada, yada, yada. But if you can just get through that and just really concentrate on the story is just incredible. Except for the last season. Anyway. Oh, and they're like, oh, okay, dude, they binged. They're done.
Are they?
They're done with it. They're done with it. They binged it so much and so fast that like they're obsessed. But anyway, all of that to say, I thought there was like some scene where like someone gets vengeful and then they like serve the enemy their own like somebody like a meat pie, and it's like, oh yeah, what am I thinking of here?
Is that Game of Thrones?
I don't know. Exactly. Anyway, man, we're getting real off the rails.
Yeah, we are. Okay. Oh, by the way, though, while we're in the boat driving from the dock, there's more synchronicity. The fact that you and I both, you finished it. I'm like over halfway through, but we both watched Barbarian this morning on our own accord, and man, it's pretty awesome.
Well, yes, and we're not going to talk about it here because I'm going to get into my other theories here. So first theory, maybe those that were enslaved were trying to be free, and so they were poisoning this guy. And then, dude, I'm just saying 320 acres is a lot of land to manage. And I don't have this number, but I would presume that he probably had a lot of slaves. And that, you know, if you had, let's just say, I mean, dude, in the hundreds probably, honestly.
I mean, I didn't really see anything, but I mean, he was super wealthy. So
super wealthy, 1800s Tennessee, definitely, dude.
But what I'm saying is, I don't know that he was like plotting all of that land per se.
Yeah, maybe
like
not. Maybe not
using it as farmland.
But he's going to at least have like 10. We'll say
he's going to have
enough people to like knock on the walls and do all kinds of different stuff at different times. So that's a possibility. Okay, let me keep going. Let me keep going. There's a lady that lived, relatively close by. When they describe somebody as being a neighbor, I don't really know how close they live if there's 320 acres between them.
It's like
but
10 miles.
There's a lady named Mary Catherine Batts who their family was kind of feuding with the Bells. She was like the daughter of the family that was, feuding. And her name was Catherine Batts. Remember back to the thing. The entity liked to be known as Kate Batts. So that's one interesting thing. Maybe this girl had some sort of vendetta because for whatever reason, her family wasn't as successful as the Bells. And, maybe it's sort of like, a Yellowstone type scenario where one, you know what I'm saying? Like, hey, this is our land. No, this is your land. You know what I mean?
Well, do we know that when the entity said that, if Catherine Batts was she alive or?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, so she
sure was. Yep. The other theory or other Bell Witch theories that I kind of saw, by the way, these three aren't really technically mine. These are other theories that I've heard that people have. So maybe the slaves were trying to get freed, and so they poisoned Mr. Bell. The other one was the feuding neighbor, Mary Catherine Batts. And then potentially that maybe they built this home on indigenous grave or sacred ground or something like that. All of that. Okay, now Here comes my crazy theory that's probably not true, but it's interesting nonetheless. John Bell, you ready for this? My theory is this. John Bell had an affair with a woman named Kate. Perhaps she had a child at the same time as Lucy when Lucy had Betsy. So now, for fear that, this is going to ruin his business, that he's an elder of the church and this won't look good if it comes out.
Yeah, no.
He murders the woman and potentially the child. I don't think so on the child part. Let's just stay on to he just murders the woman.
So basically
This
like
lady,
a vengeful spirit.
This is a vengeful spirit. She comes back. And this is where it kind of like makes sense, dude. She's not she doesn't have any, God, just hit the mic like it was like, gosh darn. She doesn't have any animosity towards Lucy, which why was she? She doesn't have any animosity towards his older son. In fact, maybe she kind of found him attractive. She doesn't have any animosity to anyone else in the family except for Betsy. Because maybe her in the vengeful spirit's mind, Betsy kind of had the life that her daughter would have had she been alive. Now, I'm going to take it up to another notch. Maybe.
Take it up a notch.
Maybe the woman that he killed, who he had an affair with, was one of the slaves on the property. And maybe the love child, the bastard, maybe the love child is the one that's like sort of leading the charge of this sort of like, maybe it's not a vengeful spirit, maybe it's just this little girl who's like raised up, knows the story because Dean kind of told her the truth, and then she's leading this charge for vengeance, poisons the man, yada, yada, yada. And I'm done.
So that's what you think?
I mean, that's just an interesting theory that I thought of. I was doing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons writing at the time, and so it's not
like. And I just watched and read The Crow. So
yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure because again, there's so many different things that happen in this one. It's hard to pinpoint like a certain aspect and say, "Oh, I think this is it." But to me, it's just there's enough sort of like odd qualities and descriptors of this family that make me think like, okay. One, the spirit warned people sometimes, Mr. Bell is not a good man. The spirit also had sort of like motherly thing about Betsy not getting married to that other guy or whatever. Just a bunch of stuff that kind of like, there might be something else going on behind closed doors within this family kind of thing. You know?
Yeah.
Or it's a time traveler.
Or it's a time traveler. Before I get into that, I just realized that we never quite explained what all happened with Andrew Jackson, how he tied into this. So, President Andrew Jackson.
You ever heard of him?
Ever heard of him? He owned property on the Red River and was planning to visit the Bell Farm after hearing like the story. So I think they tried to keep these stories sort of under wraps, at least from what I've read. They tried to keep this stuff under wraps at first. So even up until like their hair being pulled, pinched, all that stuff, they tried to like kind of keep it in the family instead of airing their dirty laundry. But then I think once it became a thing, it began sort of getting around and, people talk and stuff. It basically says one of his wagons became stuck by an unseen force and could not be moved. Despite whipping the horses, examining the wheels, and having it pushed by all the men in his party, he exclaimed, "By the eternal, boys, this is the witch." To which the witch replied, "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you again tonight." The wagon started of its own accord, and they continued on to their journey. That evening at the camp, a self-proclaimed witch layer, or witch hunter, which sounds like an anime, said he had a silver bullet and regaled the men with tales of hunting witches with it. Jackson whispered to a colleague, "I'll bet this fellow is an errant coward. By the eternals, I do wish the thing would come. I want to see him run." After which silence followed. Suddenly there was the sound of light footsteps prancing on the floor, and the voice stated, "All right, General, I am on hand and ready for business." The witch bade the witch hunter to shoot, but the gun did not fire. The hunter was struck by an unseen force, claimed to feel the pain of being struck by needles, exclaimed he had been grabbed by the nose, and fled from the tent. The witch exclaimed, "How the devil did run and beg. I'll bet he won't come through here again with his old horse pistol to shoot me. I guess that's fun enough for tonight, General, and you can go to bed now. I will come tomorrow night and show you another rascal in this crowd." Jackson was eager to stay, but his party had enough, and Jackson would eventually return to Nashville shortly thereafter. That's crazy.
Jeez,
like, that is
dude.
wild.
Yeah. What an interesting.
Yeah.
That's so crazy.
Here's sort of my theory. So when I first heard about the story years ago, I was immediately struck by that initial sort of encounter that John Bell has where he sees the half dog, half rabbit thing, appear in front of him, shoots at it, poof, it disappears. Something about that, and well, what's funny is I hadn't, up until that point, I had never even heard of the way that it apparently like introduced itself. When it said that it was like what does it say? It's like it would
from heaven and earth and hell.
Yeah, I am everywhere. I am from heaven, from hell. I'm in the air. That kind of thing. Yeah, I'm in the air. The house is any place at any time. I've been created for millions of years. So I had never even heard of that. I was just judging it from like, okay, there's all this sort of haunted stuff, and then they're seeing this like, is it some sort of shapeshifter? Is it like mid, shift, if you will? To me, it felt like, originally it felt like some sort of like, and I know we lean real heavy on like the fae and like fairies and stuff, but to me it felt like that. It felt like a very like ancient old thing, like some sort of like spirit of like the area. So like a type of like elemental type thing. Mm-hmm. And it's weird, like even trying to like say this stuff, especially like for our new listeners who may not be into this stuff. So this probably sounds silly, and when we say fairy, you immediately think of like the Disney-fied version of a fairy, but this is stuff that like our ancestors and our friends over in the British Isles and Ireland and Scotland, it's like these are things that were like very serious and very and you're really supposed to sort of approach this with a lot of caution, like the idea of like fairies and stuff. That wasn't something that you just like messed around with. And so and you look into the witch lights and the spook lights and stuff. I mean, that's the exact same thing as like the will-o'-the-wisps, and it may very well be the exact same things that I saw in my loft. So I just originally thought like, okay, to me this feels like an ancient, this sort of like elemental maybe. And again, we have no like proof of elementals being alive, but for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years, other cultures have like talked about these things. So it felt like that from what I've like researched thus far. It felt like that's sort of what it was. In doing the research now, though, I'm seeing that like, I don't know, there's an element of this that seems, there's definitely like a like trickster entity spirit sort of connotation. But to me, it feels really like it almost feels like it, and this is going to sound weird, but it almost feels like there's like multiple personalities. It's like you have, on the one hand, you have this thing saying that Lucy was the most perfect woman to ever exist. On the other hand, you have like kids being scared and like pulling their hair and like
in the face and
slapping them in the face. You have this other thing saying like, and the quotes that like Andrew Jackson, like, I mean, was once our president, talks about like how these voices would just come out of nowhere and say like, well, I'm going to show you this, da da da. So it seems very like what you said, like with it being like a vengeful kind of thing. To me, though, it feels, I don't know, is this like a, I'm going to boil it down to this. Okay, when I think of this and all the sort of multiple personalities, if you will, I think of in the Bible when the man that was possessed was confronted. He says, "I am Legion," which means it was a man that wasn't possessed by one legion or by one demon, but he was possessed by thousands of demons. So I feel like there could be, at least in my mind, there could be
similarity there.
Some sort of tie-in with like all these multiple personalities, like this sort of, maybe it is like a demonic type attachment, or maybe it's both. Maybe it is demonic, but then maybe it's also this earth elemental ancient thing that's lived on the land for thousands of years. And I mean, it even says I was created millions of years ago. So to me, it feels very like Lovecraftian. It feels very,
dude.
But there is definitely like
patron, some old school, like ancient,
like old gods.
Yeah.
Sort of like a Manly Wade Wellman type thing, maybe a little too.
A little Neil Gaiman sprinkled on top.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I've said this before, like for my wife, it's like anything scary happens, immediately demons. And so I have a natural sort of aversion to that, but there is something that just seems very like schizophrenic about this that would lead me to, the Legion character in the Bible.
Man, that's a really interesting take that I didn't even think of. The fact that there could be so many different personalities, man, that's cool.
Well, and it's like all these like bizarre things. I mean, and of course you have to take a lot of this at face value to even sort of go to the next step with what we're doing. But the slave, it's appearing to like this slave, and it like turned him into a mule. It beat him. It would show up as a dog with two heads or no head. John Bell saw it as a half rabbit, half dog. It's like, is this like this ancient old thing? Or is it just this like sort of the god Pan and like this like satyr type? Is it like this fey, like ultra trickster spirit who's just playing a giant, he's just trolling everybody?
Yeah.
Or she, you know? I don't know.
Or maybe it's, an old ancient power that was brought over.
I love it. I love that stuff.
From Africa, and I mean, maybe that there's a way, like, I just love the idea of these old school cultures, man, that, I mean, of course I don't even think we have to say if it's unfortunate that that's the way that it was brought here, but past that, okay? Like, these ancient cultures that have these things that we don't know of in our own sort of history and culture,
right?
And the fact that like there's something that could be tapped into that, man, I don't know. I just love that kind of stuff. It's so cool.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. It's kind of like when we talk about like the Indians or like indigenous people, how everything is so heavily steeped in like oral traditions that, unless you're kind of in on it, unless you grew up within like a reservation or closely within like a group like that, you would never hear, you wouldn't know about any of that stuff. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's definitely cool. Especially when you say like, bringing, and that's like such a Neil Gaiman American Gods thing, but like that idea of like these sort of like hitchhikers, or they're basically, he talks about in American Gods, like, on the hearts and minds of like these like Scandinavian people, they brought over Loki and Thor and like the gods like in their hearts and minds into the new world. Yeah. And it's like there's just something about that that's so cool.
It's not only so cool, but it's also kind of like you can see you can understand how that like theory works in a way. Like you're now moving a belief system and a power, so to speak, to another part of the world, and it's being taken. I don't know, man. It's very, it's so cool, And again, we don't worship Thor and the Norse gods, but the cool thing about Gaiman is like there's a ton of that stuff in American Gods, for example, that like you don't know about until unless you're like a student of Norse mythology or like any of those other mythologies. and cultures and archetypes that you just have never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
Just, man, it's so cool to like dig into that stuff. And here lately, man, I've really been kind of getting into like wanting to learn more and kind of relearn Roman mythology and the Greek mythology and the Norse gods and just learn about those myths and stories, man. There's so that they're like, it's so rich worth of like stories, man. It's just so good. Dude, I got to say, man, for all the begging that you've done for us to cover this, it's not like I was denying it. It's just like every single topic that we're like, we got to do this one day. I'm telling you, man, we got to do this one day. I feel like this was the perfect time. It just worked out so perfectly for this to be us closing out Halloween with a historically fascinating story that doesn't just have its tentacles in the Hopkinsville Goblins story, but also a U.S. president was involved.
Yeah, right.
You know, I mean, it's amazing. It's another one of those things. We don't really know exactly what's going on here, but I love all of these theories, man. And somehow maybe a piece of every bit of it is what gives us this incredible, spooky story.
Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying that, you know, there's a reason that it's sort of known as America's most popular or most famous ghost story, because it's, you know, once you start looking into it, boy, it is an endless rabbit trail. And there's also a lot to do with, man, we have to make like a road trip to get up there. But then there's also a connection with like the Bell Witch Cave.
Yeah, no, I saw that and I didn't even dive in that way because I figured
same here.
Maybe we cover that over on the Patreon, get a little bit deeper into it. I said
I'm down with
Patreon,
that.
Kind of weird. I think I said Patreon.
But yeah, we are, you know, sad to see you go, October. But I feel like it was a blast. And like Woody said, this was a great finale to close out a great October Spooktacular. If you want to hit us up, you can find us over on Instagram. Feel free to shoot us a DM or jump on in the comments. The water's fine. If you have a story or an urban legend in your area, Woody and I were speaking earlier, and he just did a run through of all the countries that we have listeners in. And man, that's a lot of amazing possibilities of stories and folktales and urban legends in your area.
Yeah.
So listen, we would love to hear all that stuff. If you're nervous and you want to write it out, feel free to shoot it to thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com. And, you know, we can talk about it on the show, or we narrate the story and put some cool sound design behind it. But anyway, we would love to hear from you. So the best thing to do, even beyond Instagram and our Gmail, is thatwouldberadpodcast.com. There you can do everything. You can jump on any podcatcher. You can leave 5-star reviews, which we thank you kindly. The most importantly, you can actually tell us your story straight from the site. Like, it records like a recording for us, which is amazing. Yeah, so we really, really enjoyed this spooky season, and we couldn't have done it without you, and already gearing up for next year. So we love you. We appreciate you. Keep staying spooky out there. And as always,
be rad.
That's the way it goes.
My favorite song on the radio.
clouds in a time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead before you became a ghost. You always said our future would be a parade of flowers, but now all that's left is a single rose. That's the way it goes.
Did you hear my throat just then?
Do what?
Was that my throat or your throat? Or was it the Bell Witch, man? See, here we go again. Hold on, man. Let me adjust my mic here. I'm getting on my knees about to say a prayer. Hello?
I can't hear you anymore, buddy.
Man, I cannot. Hello?
What is happening?
Dude, are you messing with me, man?
Can you hear me, pal? Hello, bud. I can't hear you anymore.
Hey, bro, can you hear me?
I swear, when we start talking about ghosts, it's like